Hello, you're very welcome to this Kerry Health Nutrition Institute webinar, Adapting Appetites, in which we will look at scientific and industry perspectives on the rise of GLP-1s. Certainly a hot topic across food, beverage, and pharma. Specifically today, we're going to look at the latest scientific insights on GLP-1 medications, trends in user behavior, nutrition essentials for users, and innovation opportunities in food and beverage products tailored to user needs. My name is Mark Farty, and I'm joined by a number of esteemed guests and colleagues to take us through the subject. Firstly, we have Professor Catherine Godson, Professor of Molecular Medicine at University College Dublin and Director of the UCD Diabetes Complications Research Centre. Catherine has an international reputation in scientific research gained through a long and successful academic career in the US, Switzerland, and at University College Dublin. She is a global expert in diabetes as well as on inflammation and cardiovascular and kidney diseases. Catherine is the Associate Dean for Research and Innovation at UCD's School of Medicine, as well as being Director of the Diabetes Complications Research Centre at the UCD Conway Institute and the UCD School of Medicine. We're also joined by Elizabeth Horvath, Vice President for Marketing at Kerry, where she leads a global team that drives category strategy, demand generation, consumer insights, and commercial storytelling, partnering with the world's largest food and beverage brands. Elizabeth's leadership spans both strategy and execution, with the need for a keen understanding of the macro environment and how commercial strategy should translate in that context. Next, we are delighted to be joined by Angie Jefferson, nutrition consultant at the British Nutrition Foundation. Angie has previously worked in various positions in the UK's National Health Service, where she discovered her passion for nutrition's essential role in public health and disease prevention. Angie joined the British Nutrition Foundation in 2025 to help further their work in supporting industry on food systems transformation. Angie is also a registered nutritionist and dietitian. And lastly, we have Dr. Alexandra Bulrick, Vice President for Research, Development and Applications for the Proactive Health and Food Protection portfolios at Kerry. Having served in multiple international senior leadership roles in the food and beverage industry for over 25 years, Dr. Bulrick has extensive experience in science-based concept ideation, product development, clinical evidence generation, and digital health. She joined Kerry in 2022, where she leads an international team of scientists that drive strategic programs related to digestive health, immune, cognitive, women, and infants' health. Catherine, Elizabeth, Angie, Alexandra, thank you very much for being with us. We're all set for a very good conversation. Professor Godson, we might begin with you. Can you give us a grounding in these important medications and provide an overview of the latest scientific insights?
Thanks a lot, Mark. So I thought it would be helpful for us to think a little about what exactly are GLPs. So we've known for a long time that under healthy conditions that glucose, when taken orally, drives a much stronger insulin response than when an equivalent dose of glucose is taken by any other route. And this is what we call the incretin response. And when we look at what it is that drives the incretin response, we know that specific cells in the gut produce different hormones that we call incretin hormones, including GIP and GLP-1 are glucagon-like peptides. So what these do is they stimulate the pancreas to produce insulin. So we know that in type 2 diabetes, one of the principal defects in type 2 diabetes is a lack of insulin production in response to a glucose load. So it seemed reasonable that these incretin hormones might be a useful treatment for type 2 diabetes. But of course, what's reasonable isn't always feasible. And so the big challenge was to see if we could mimic the incretin response. But the problem here is that the incretin hormones have a very short half-life. They're very unstable. So various maneuvers were made to try and inhibit their breakdown. And a big breakthrough came through this is the Gila lizard, which is native to South America. And what was just to the southwest United States. And what was found about this Gila lizard was that actually it had a GLP-1 hormone, which was very similar to the human hormone, but it was much more stable. So essentially using the lizard's GLP-1 as a template, a series of drugs have been developed that are used in the treatment of type 2 diabetes. And these have been developed with enhanced pharmacokinetic properties that inhibits their breakdown and their clearance. And these include, for example, liraglutide, which was licensed for treatment of type 2 diabetes in 2010, and semaglutide. Liraglutide is used as a daily injection, semaglutide as a weekly injection. So how do these work? Well, we know that principally in the context of type 2 diabetes, why these are useful is that they actually stimulate the islet cells of the pancreas to produce insulin and other hormones that regulate responses to insulin. And so they're effective at glycemic control. But what was also noted was that these drugs delay gastric emptying, and most interestingly, they reduce food intake and subsequently cause weight loss. So this was obviously of great interest. And very importantly, as I'm going to show you, what's most interesting about these incretin hormone-based drugs, or the GLP-1s, is that they don't only act on the cells of the pancreas. So we know that in type 2 diabetes that there are very significant complications associated with diabetes. So for example, big incidence of heart attack, of stroke, and indeed of kidney failure. And what was discovered was that the GLP-1 or the incretin drugs were associated with decreased cardiovascular disease and were protective in the vascular complications of diabetes, such as kidney disease. And were very beneficial. And what's really interesting here is that these vascular benefits were actually seen independently of their role in regulating blood glucose. So given that the drugs delayed gastric emptying and caused weight loss, the next approach was to see whether they might be effective in obesity. So in the first instance, they were trialed in people with BMI of over 30 or in those with a BMI of over 27 and with a high risk of the vascular complications of obesity. And in this case, what was seen was that both liraglutide and semaglutide were both effective in causing at least a 5% weight loss in obesity. And of course, obesity is also associated with serious cardiovascular complications. And what was very important was to note that the drugs were beneficial in the context of cardiovascular outcomes, indeed independently of weight loss effects. And as these drugs have gone on to be further developed, the newer drugs include tirzepatide, or we're going to hear about it later as Mounjaro. And tirzepatide actually is a drug that targets both GLP-1 and GIP, which was one of the other incretin hormones that I mentioned. So these are known as twincretins because they target two of the incretin hormones. So we now know that the established indications for using GLP-1s, where they have remarkable efficacy, include obesity, type 2 diabetes, as we've discussed. They're also licensed in obstructive sleep apnea and in cardiovascular disease, as I've mentioned, including heart attack and stroke, in diabetic kidney disease, in metabolic liver disease, and in osteoarthritis. Several new indications are being investigated, including in type 1 diabetes, in peripheral artery disease, in chronic kidney disease, and various disorders of the central nervous system. So these are under active investigation. And as we see here, the key message really is that GLP-1, the action of GLP-1s is way beyond the islet cells in the pancreas. So as I've mentioned, they're associated with decreased heart attack in high-risk individuals, decreased atherosclerosis, decreased metabolic liver disease, and decreased diabetic kidney disease. What's of particular interest at the moment is there's a lot of interest in their effects in neurological disorders, for example, in Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, and also in neuropsychiatric disorders. And there's a lot of interest in the way that GLP-1 can signal either in the brain or to the brain through vagal stimulation. And a lot of these activities seem to focus on anti-inflammatory responses to the agents. So what about their safety, their tolerability, and the relative roles in weight loss, as we'll hear more about later. So the GI side effects really limit the use of these drugs in some people. So these side effects can be counteracted by a more slower adaptation, so slowly titrating up the dose. In the newer versions of the drug, they seem to be associated with less of these off-target effects on the GI system. Of course, with weight loss, there's a potential loss in muscle mass, and the efficacy of the drugs in terms of retaining muscle mass is really maximized by resistance exercise in combination with the drugs. Some of the newer drugs that are being developed actually are potential drugs being developed, should I say, include agents that are both GLPs and have muscle myogenic properties. Interestingly, the weight loss effects are seen that people, there seem to be very different levels of response. Typically, women can be hyper responders. People with type 2 diabetes show less weight loss effects. And the newer drugs, so for example, tirzepatide versus semaglutide, which would be an older drug, tirzepatide, the newer incretin, shows much greater efficacy as regards weight loss. As we're going to hear about later, there is, of course, a lot of evidence that once people stop taking these drugs, the weight loss is overcome, or they regain the weight that they have lost. Again, a lot of investigation trying to establish drugs where the weight loss is persistent. Other issues with the drugs are, of course, they're expensive, and they're expensive because they are injectable. So the latest developments are really around using oral GLPs, and they seem to have equivalent efficacy to injectables, and these will significantly reduce the cost of the drugs, as well as, of course, the fact that the patents lifespan of the patents. So there are 3 billion people in the world with overweight or obesity, and I suppose we have to ask, are we looking at the Holy Grail? Well, for various reasons, we're not really, because of course 10 to 15% of people, the drugs are ineffective in terms of weight loss, even when they adhere to their regimen, to the prescribed regimens. However, these drugs are effective in treating obesity, and they will be part of the armamentarium going forward. And the 3 billion people are unlikely to be able to control their weight with diet and exercise alone. So these really are game changers, and remarkable for the speed with which they have come on board and have been adapted and indeed developed. So thank you very much. Back to you, Mark.
Thank you, Professor Godson. Fascinating insight there on the emergence of these medications, their mechanisms for effect and potential. Elizabeth, from the point of view of user behaviors, what are we seeing there, and how is that influencing uptake of these products?
Thanks, Mark. A big part of my role is really to understand the global consumer purchase behavior that is, of course, going to change, or their eating preferences that are going to change as part of being GLP-1 users. So what we've really tried to do is understand across a few key global markets, the United States, the UK, and some parts of LATAM, to really understand this consumer base and what's happening in terms of what are their preferences, what are they looking for in their diets, what products are they buying more of, what are they buying less of. And so really what we wanted to do is we started with the US consumer, just given that the US consumer is really driving adoption here. So in North America, we did a quantitative survey with over 2,000, almost 2,600 consumers. And really, we wanted to understand their purchase drivers and their preferences across their full GLP-1 journey. So a lot of data that's out there about how consumers are interacting with the drugs and what their food and beverage intake is really focuses on existing users and consumers that are on the drug today. We really wanted to understand across the full journey of their weight loss, how do food and beverages change and their preferences change? So we looked at consumers considering the drug. We also looked at consumers recently starting the drugs. And then we also looked at consumers that had recently stopped, as well as long-term users that plan on stay for a long period of time. In addition, we wanted to understand the differences between a diabetic consumer versus one that's more motivated by weight loss. And really our end goal was to understand what the GLP-1 drugs were doing to their purchasing behaviors and their food and beverage priorities. And then what I think is really interesting, in the UK, we really wanted to supplement this research with a more qualitative approach and a more ethnographic approach. So what we did in the UK to supplement our US insight is we looked at 22 UK consumers, and we had a 1-week in-depth relationship with these consumers. And we looked at their habits throughout the day, from the time they got up, eating breakfast, sending kids off to school, perhaps making food for their family, grocery shopping, exercising. So we really wanted to understand their daily activities. And we also looked at recent users versus long-term users, as well as those that had recently stopped. And ultimately what we found through this work is consistently, pun intended, one size does not fit all with this consumer group. So it might be easy to group these consumers all in one bucket area and say, this is how we need to approach this consumer demographic that is taking GLP-1 drugs. However, that's just not the case. Similar to general population, all consumers are different. And what we found from our consumer work is that there's 5 very specific consumer segments here. So if we take the total population of GLP-1 users and we break it down, this is the split of the consumer personas. I'm just going to touch on each of them very briefly. We're not going to go in depth onto each one. We actually have a separate report that you're welcome to download on our website that talks about the details of each of these. So the first one there, the future focused improver, she is 27% of the GLP-1 user base, or the opportunity, as we'd like to call it. She is very focused on healthy aging. So she's interested in long-term decisions and basically updating her habits to focus on longevity. So that's 27% of the opportunity. The gentleman then, the trailblazing trendsetter, as we'd like to call him, he's 25% of the opportunity. And he is the young millennial gentleman who loves anything viral, likes to try all the new stuff. He's a heavy supplement user, and he likes all of the new products that are launching that appeal to him. So very trend forward, and loves to get his information from social media, from advertisements. And he's also the one telling all of his friends about what are the new things to try. The woman in the middle, the balance maintainer, she's 16% of the opportunity. She's much younger. She's your Gen Z consumer. She's the one that is wanting to try GLP-1 drugs for weight loss, but are going to do it for a very short period of time. She wants a quick fix. She also doesn't have the income yet to really sustain over a long period of time the usage of the medication. And she again, from an income standpoint, often is living at home still with parents, maybe right out of school. And so again, is looking for a quick fix. And then, as her name would say, the balance maintainer, she's interested in, after that quick fix, having food and beverage products or products out in the market that are going to help her maintain without being on the drugs. The dynamic dad, he's our next, is 27% of the opportunity. He is your quintessential American soccer dad. He is on the go. He wants things that are convenient. He's grabbing things from food service operators. He's your convenience store consumer. He's grabbing and going things at the checkout line. And so he's really looking for those high protein, health forward, convenient options. He's also a big opportunity for our food service operators. So if we have any food service operators listening, he is definitely your core GLP-1 consumer. And then last but not least, and probably the most important insight on this page, is over on the right-hand side, you see the steady sticker. She represents about 10 to 11% of the opportunity. And she is the only GLP-1 consumer that is not changing her purchasing habits. So that's the main message here, is about 90% of GLP-1 users are changing their relationship with food and beverage. Our steady sticker on the far right is not. She is loyal. She wants to keep doing what she's doing. She's stuck in her ways, and she's going to pretend, right, keeping her food and beverage intake the same, or the brands that she eats the same, or the categories that she eats the same, and still expect a different result. So it's actually quite a big opportunity out there for the food and beverage industry to address these 90% of GLP-1 consumers that are changing their relationship with food. So really, when we think about what they're looking for, so we just said not all GLP-1 consumers are created equal. One size does not fit fit all. However, there were some similarities across all of the consumer groups that I wanted to call out. So firstly, long-term health. Longevity is important to everyone. Healthy aging is important to everyone, some more than others. In addition, the supplement and vitamin space is going to be booming for this consumer group. About 90% of all of the users are actually already in this space and taking, whether that be probiotics and prebiotics or looking at botanical supplements or looking at multivitamins, they're already in that space and they're looking for solutions from food and beverage as well. And then what's most interesting in terms of functional benefits is 2/3 of all of these consumers are looking at multiple need states, as we would say, that they are looking to solve for. And we included the exhaustive list here on the right-hand side, but you see it ranges anything from brain and cognitive health down to immune support, heart health, cardiovascular health. So 2/3 of consumers are looking for a multitude of benefits and are looking for products that can appeal to all of these. I would like to call out two in particular. The brain and cognitive health one was very surprising to us. And I actually think it's a huge opportunity for the industry to reframe how we're thinking about brain and cognitive health. Previously, we had been thinking about that space as maybe more in the healthy aging or maybe in terms of stress reduction. But what we found from this consumer group is that they really want to feel uplifted, a mood uplift. They want energy. They want to feel like ready to go harness the day. And they take that as mental health. So mental health being very important to this consumer group. So I do think that's an opportunity that's untapped. The other one that I'll call out, which I know we'll speak about at length here in a moment, is around digestion and gut health. Overwhelmingly, this consumer group comes off of the GLP-1 drugs potentially because of digestive discomfort. And that is a need that the industry needs to help these consumers to solve. So when we look at their purchasing shifts, probably not surprisingly, each of our consumer groups interacts a little bit differently. So this is a bit of a more overarching generalization, but really what we're looking for from the food service side is, not surprisingly, consumers are going more to beverage. So on the far left, eating less in terms of fried and maybe foods previously considered unhealthy, and replacing those oftentimes with beverages. So we're seeing a big uptick in tea and coffee, in smoothies, and as we would say in the United States, refreshers, which also usually have caffeine in them. From a retail standpoint, from a grocery side, not surprisingly, again, the beverage space being a huge opportunity. So whether that be meal replacement, protein powders, functional waters, electrolyte drinks, and then, of course, things that are smaller portions around like snack and nutritional bars. Whereas previously, maybe consumers would have been eating more breads, more sweet snacks, more salty snacks. And overwhelmingly, we are seeing consumers reduce their alcohol intake as well. So that is something to keep in mind here in terms of what we plan to see coming through retail purchases in the next year or two. We also wanted to touch on kind of three maybe overarching themes coming through, not just purchase behaviors, functional need states we've already covered, but what are kind of three very interesting takeaways that maybe we wouldn't have expected. Now, this is very specific to the UK consumer. However, we have validated this in the US as well. The first one being food noise. We did a lot of consumer interviews. Like I said, we followed them around for a week and we got to see their full day. And their main takeaway here is, especially when they first start the medication, the food noise is a bit quieter. It's dampened. So you don't get quite the, let's call it your fridge talking to you, say, please eat me, please eat me. So they overwhelmingly have just said that noise and your mental capacity of thinking about food has gone away. And so when we think about what that means for the food and beverage industry, I think it's going to be imperative for all of us that are looking to appeal to this consumer group is they might not have that food noise all the time. So you really need to break through that and be in their face and be, front of purchase decisions in the store. And I think retail merchandising is going to have a big part to play here. The second, sweetness. Sweetness is definitely on the downturn. We saw a lot of consumers stay away from sweeter products, not just because they're baked goods and candy and confections, but actually because the flavor profile, just not that cravings for sweetness. We actually saw more cravings or more pull towards bold, savory flavors. And we saw that in the US overwhelmingly as well, kind of those bold, adventurous, maybe more global flavors. And then lastly, thirst. We talked a lot about consumers moving to beverage categories versus food categories. And really that is driven by wanting to reduce your intake, but it's also being driven by thirst. And I think it's one of the biggest opportunities out there in the United States, especially at this point in time, is that hydration category. So really what we wanted to do is highlight this through a quick video. And here we have three consumers, Laura, David, and Andy. And we just wanted to give you a sense of the ethnographic work that we did to really understand the needs of these consumers and just hear from their own voices. So we're going to go ahead and play a quick video from our friend David here.
I drink quite a bit before bedtime. I'm quite thirsty in the evening, so a couple of glasses of squash or Diet Apple Tango, that's my favorite go-to drink.
All right, that was David, but just to give you a sense, we have videos from dozens of consumers talking about how thirst has impacted their GLP-1 journey. So for example, Laura over here on the left-hand side, Laura is a new user of GLP-1 medications, and she's actually talking about how thirst has been her biggest barrier and one of the most unexpected things from coming on the drugs when she first started. And then Andy over on the far right there, he talks a little bit about actually it's the bubbles that were helping him maintain his hunger. And the bubbling not only was helping his thirst, but was helping him stay satisfied. And so again, I think there's a huge opportunity for our beverage brands and beverage companies to really grab hold of this hydration opportunity and make food and beverage products here that are going to be focused on hydration, but also with lower sugar and with a better nutritional profile. So with that, just some key takeaways. If you want to download a full report of all of this consumer insight work that we've done, you're welcome to visit kerry.com for the US report, and the UK one will be coming soon. And we also have a lot of data on our LATAM consumers, as we know this demographic is moving there quickly. So with that, Mark, back over to you.
Excellent insight. So important to include user context and behaviors at the heart of considerations here. So thank you, Elizabeth, for that. Next, we're going to turn our focus now to the nutritional needs of GLP-1 users, and Angie Jefferson from the British Nutrition Foundation will give us some perspectives on that. The British Nutrition Foundation is a charity that exists to promote health and well-being and prevent diet-related ill health through evidence-based nutrition science. Their team of nutrition scientists and education professionals bridge between science, government, industry, education, and people. Angie, what nutrition essentials do users really need to look out for in this space?
Thank you so much for inviting me to talk with you today. What are the new unique considerations? Well, let's think a minute about the medications. So essentially there's three. There's tirzepatide, which is Mounjaro, semaglutide, which is Wegovy, and liraglutide, which used to be Saxenda here in the UK, but that's recently been replaced by two generic formulations. So that's come off patent, and so now access is getting cheaper and more broadly accessible. And then at the bottom of the slide, there's reference to the oral forms, which again for the UK we're expecting towards the end of 2026. So that has finished its third phase trials, and they're now going through regulatory processes. There's another formulation following on shortly after that, so that will be hitting us in 2027, which is good news in terms of cost and accessibility for patients. It's really good news for countries where they don't have cold chain distribution, so it's really going to open up these medications to much more of the global population, which is obviously vital for their health as well as those of us in the Western world. What we are facing though is the challenge of misinformation around GLP and appetite. So no matter where you look, whether that's in national media, whether it's in professional media, or whether it's in social media, so your Pinterests and your TikToks and things like that, there are lots and lots of sensationalist stories around about how is GLP use changing your intake, your nutrient status, different food groups. So let's actually look at some of the evidence base for what's actually going on. So if we start with the energy intake of users of GLPs, well, we know that energy intakes are falling because people are getting dramatic weight loss. On the slide here, I've summarised some of the key studies looking at, these are single meal studies looking at average changes in energy intake. So these are people who've come into a lab. Most of the time they've had a controlled breakfast, and then they've been able to freely choose the foods that they've eaten at a lunchtime meal. These studies, there aren't that many of them. So literally around the globe, there's 14, 15 studies that have looked at energy intakes of people on GLPs. The average is around a 16 to 39% reduction compared to people on a placebo or not using GLPs. And if we look at diet recall, then there's even less of these. There is literally 4 studies currently published looking at dietary recall, suggesting calorie intakes are falling by 300 to 500 calories a day. Now, one thing we know from both of these study methodologies is that there is a lot of underreporting. So, for example, the dietary recall studies generally underestimate intakes by around 30%. So we really don't have good, solid scientific information to tell us how much less are people eating each day. All we can work on is that we know people say they're eating less, and we know they lose a lot of weight. The other thing we don't know much about at the moment is what is this doing in terms of macronutrient intake. So, if they're eating less energy, is that coming from protein, fat, carbohydrates? What's happening with their fibre intake? We really don't know that much in terms of actual scientific evidence. In terms of body composition, the other thing we need to consider here is that all the evidence so far suggests that people using GLP medications are losing a far greater proportion of lean muscle mass compared to people using other weight loss methods. And if you look in terms of hierarchy, you will lose more lean mass on a GLP medication than if you've undergone bariatric surgery, compared to if you've used traditional weight loss of calorie restriction and exercise. So there is a concern there that people are losing lean body mass, and that lean body mass could be bone, it could be muscle, it could be organ mass. We don't really know which body compartments this is coming from. And then the other thing we don't know much about is, are people gaining functional muscle mass as they lose weight and maybe become more active? So there are lots of question marks here as well. What we do know is the studies that have combined GLP medications with resistance exercise, so stimulating muscle and trying to prevent loss or trying to build muscle, have been quite successful in reducing the amount of muscle that's lost or the lean mass that's lost, or indeed increasing it. So we know that resistance exercise is absolutely key for anybody taking GLP medications. When it comes to micronutrient intakes, we know even less. There is very, very little information on the impact of GLP medications on people's micronutrient status. What we do know is that it doesn't matter whether you're dieting or not. If you look at any population around the world, the incidence of micronutrient deficiencies is quite high. The second thing we know is that among obese populations, and I've shown you some stats here on the slide, amongst obese populations, the incidence of micronutrient deficiencies is higher than the general population. And we know that for most people trying to lose weight, they are likely to increase their nutrient deficiencies as their food and energy intake falls. So we don't have evidence to say that people are on GLPs have worsening micronutrient deficiencies, but we can assume that they probably have baseline micronutrient deficiencies from probably having attempted dieting on and off over the decade or two in some cases before they start on GLP medications. So we can probably assume that any GLP user has a micronutrient deficiency, and we need to either be given some very targeted dietary advice in terms of nutrient density, or advising that they do take a general broad spectrum multivitamin and mineral each day. The other concern that we have got is that weight regain after GLP discontinuation is the weight rebound, again, is higher compared to other methods of weight loss. So for most people who successfully lose weight, the weight will gradually keep back on, but it just seems to be exacerbated when you discontinue GLP medication. So here's the results of one trial. There are various trials which are showing, they're all showing similar things. So what we need to do is get better at stepping in at the point of stopping medication and making sure that people have strategies in place to keep the weight off. One of those will be exercise, and resistance exercise in particular, and the other will obviously have built better habits to make sure that they are managing their eating and following healthy eating to keep, to try and keep the weight off once they finish. The fear of yo-yo dieting, of losing weight and then putting a lot back on quickly, is that while you lose a mixture of lean mass and fat mass, preferably more fat mass than lean, that's what we're aiming for, when you put weight back on, after rapid weight loss, you're tending to gain almost 100% fat. So if you lose weight and then put it back on again afterwards, you can actually end up with a higher body fat percentage than when you started. So that is a real concern. So I don't really have any magic bullets in terms of particular nutrient requirements for GLP users. All I can say is that usage is running way ahead of the actual research that we've got. So we need a lot more research into relapse and weight regain and how do we counteract that. We're starting to get some insights into how eating habits change, but we need much more work there. We need to quantify better energy intakes. We need to look at the impact on the gut microbiome. There's an awful lot of areas of research that we still need to elucidate before we come out with anything really hard and fast as to the unique nutritional requirements of GLP users. So that's a quick summary, and back to Mark. Thank you.
Angie, thank you very much. A very important perspective there. Finally, we're moving now to Dr. Bullrich. And Alexandra, what innovation opportunities does all of this present for food and beverage?
Thank you, Mark, and happy to be here. And what I will try to do is to combine everything we've heard so far and see how can we bring them into actionable strategies for the food industry. And maybe let me start by saying there's a lot of things already happening, right? I mean, if you look at the food industry, of course, over the last 24 months, I think, there's a realization that this is a large new target group, and that's a target group that's here to stay. And although there are special needs for these consumers also want, like every other consumer, to have a good choice of tasty and well-liked products and food products that they can share with their friends and family. Then on the other hand, what you also see happening in certain supermarkets or health stores is specific parts of aisles that are focusing and targeting those GLP-1 users. And for instance, you see an example here in the middle where there is a whole aisle full of supplements primarily that could support the GLP-1 users for their side effects. And then on the other hand, also there's these consumer good companies that are already thinking like, how can we reposition the products that we have for this specific target group, but also innovate in this space. Now, when we look at these consumers, and you've heard a lot about it already, one of the things that we see over and over again from our consumer research is that one of the pain points is digestive health issues. And it can be either constipation or diarrhea or nausea, and they have a big impact on the quality of life. A runner-up is also fatigue. We didn't hear so much about it, but it's not so strange, of course. People eat less, they get less energy, less calories in, And at the same time, if you have GI discomfort, you can imagine that people feel tired and basically their energy is down. So we see that 87% of these people say, look, this really has an impact on my quality of life. And 80% of these people is looking at us as a food industry to see, are there solutions or are there support that they can get from food and, food and ingredients and supplements. So there's a lot to do here. And this is the consumer's voice. But if you then think about healthcare professionals, and we did a whole survey with healthcare professionals, you see very similar feedback. Also there, people say, the medical doctors say, look, the GI discomfort that people experience, they really can cause a discontinuation of the drug use. And especially in the first couple of months when people are titrating into the drug, there are many issues related to the GI. These same healthcare professionals also think that specific ingredients, like for instance probiotics, could help to alleviate some of those symptoms, for instance constipation, but they could also help to make sure that a healthier microbiome is supported. We know when people lose a lot of weight, and also people that are on these drugs, their microbiome is changing. And how can we make sure that that microbiome remains healthy and is supported? And last but not least, and what is mentioned already a couple of times this afternoon, is the rapid weight loss that will result in the loss of lean body mass and muscle. And that's also seen by healthcare professionals as a key problem or challenge for this consumer group. And I think what is good to understand is that, of course, there's not one moment in which a consumer is a GLP-1 user and has the specific needs. Actually, weight management and also the use of these drugs is a lifetime journey. And there are different phases in weight management. And each phase has different challenges and provides also solutions or opportunities, for us to bring solutions as a food industry. From early discontinuation, which might be caused by GI symptoms that we could support with, probiotics or fibers, to, the real active phase when weight loss is there, but unfortunately also a decrease in muscle mass, for instance, and people are looking for high protein products, for instance. Unfortunately, when people stop the medication, and as Angie also showed, a lot of people regain the weight, and while they're doing that, of course, they don't want this. And so they're looking also for solutions in the supplements, in the food industry to see, okay, what are the products that can support them to keep the weight off? And then, unfortunately, if the weight is regained, a lot of metabolic issues that they had before their weight loss come back again. And again, there, I think, as an industry, we can see what are the solutions that we can bring for these consumers. And if you think about everything you heard, during this session, you can think about different concepts that we could think of. For instance, concepts all around muscle, right? Called here muscle guard. So try to prevent muscle loss, or, the impaired nutrients uptake that we have. And at the same time, also address digestive comfort. So you can think about, the best quality of protein, high protein, but also additions to the product to increase protein absorption, like probiotics or enzymes or so, and also support digestive health. Another topic that we heard was the thirst, and that people are looking for hydration. And so you could think about an hydrating lean formula that would address consumer pain points as dehydration, and again, also muscle loss, and, digestive issues. I think Elizabeth also shared that people are also looking for mental support. It could be related to stress or to energy. So actually what you could do is make, I would say, a beverage, a product that addresses both the hydration as well as these other pain points. And last but not least, you could think about a whole drink that is really focused on GI comfort, which, could bring a lot of good source of fiber there, but also probiotics, prebiotics to support digestive health. So these are just examples of products that we see out there, and that I'm sure will be coming much more in the future. One topic that we wanted to dive a little bit deeper of was the challenges on innovating in high protein products. I think we see everywhere, in those countries where GLP-1 drugs are popular, is that there is a real need for high protein that together with exercise could help to prevent muscle loss. However, to make products with high protein content, it's not easy. First thing is the taste and texture are really challenged. Lots of high protein products are chalky and also have some off taste. So that's one thing. But then the same consumers don't just want to have a high protein product. They also want a product that is low in carbohydrates and low in fat, which makes formulation even more challenging. The same consumer is also still a consumer that likes to understand what's in the product and recognize the ingredients. So clean label also for this product consumer group is really important. And again, functional ingredients like we just mentioned for digestive health, but also for mental health or immune health. As the gastric emptying is impaired or at least slowed down in GLP-1 patients, protein absorption and digestibility is also changing. So how can we make sure that we have the right protein and that it's still absorbed and digested in the right way? So also something to think about. And all of these things, we need to make sure that we do this at a high speed because innovation is needed rapidly. So a lot of challenges and a lot of opportunities. So to bring it all together, in what's the so what then for the industry? I think the first thing is about innovation. And what you see in the forward-looking companies is they already started to adapt. And they are positioning their current products or products that are aligned to the needs for this specific consumer group. So that's a form of adaptation. At the same time, we see a lot of new products entering the market. Indeed, the high protein, high fiber, but also different pack sizes, like a snack box or smaller meal parts or anything that is more linked to the more satiated consumer that we have right now. A next step could be to say, look, can we also mimic the GLP-1 drugs? Of course, not to the extent that the drugs work, that's clear. But when consumers get off the pharma, the medicines, they are looking for some support to prevent regain. And is there anything we can do from a supplement perspective to help to satiate those consumers further? In the end, of course, as a whole industry, we will, embrace and integrate this new customer and consumer group. And, we think, for instance, about the retailers, right? They have to rethink the shelf space and their portfolio and their categories. If we look at food service, they could think about lighter meals, smaller meals, but more nutritious meals. And of course, the big CPGs, they will have to think about adapting and meet the evolving satiety, the evolving sensory and nutritional needs of these new group of consumers. But knowing the creativity of the industry and the knowledge, I'm sure we'll see many exciting products in the years to come in this field. So thank you for your attention. And with that, I go back to Mark.
Thank you, Dr. Bulwick. That perspective really closes the loop for us in terms of the rising phenomenon and what it may mean for industry. We want to dig a little deeper now and look in more detail at some of the points you've each raised. So maybe, Alexandra, starting with you, you mentioned the innovation agenda that's emerging. How do you see industry keeping pace with consumers who use GLP-1s? Are we seeing many innovations hit the market already?
Yeah, I think, Mark, we are seeing some companies that are more still in an adapting phase. So basically they reposition products that they already have. But I see more and more you'll see really also new products coming to market that are really focused on this new consumer group. Of course, we're all still searching, I think, as an industry, like what are the most promising products to offer to this consumer group. Sometimes it's as simple as making smaller sizes, and sometimes it's really about new ingredients. And I think especially in the protein space, there is a lot of activity, I would say, higher and higher levels of protein, different types of protein. And I think from a supplement perspective, you see really, new supplements that are looking at the nutrition, needs, but also at, the GI discomfort. So in conclusion, I think we see many new things coming. I expect still much more to come. But it's a very active innovation space. And, maybe just one more point. I see also that different companies are working together. So maybe more suppliers plus, the end customers, but also customers together with universities and institutes really trying to innovate at speed. So much more to come, I think, there.
Thank you, Alex. Angie, you mentioned concerns about the risks of GLP-1 use and yo-yo dieting, as it's called. What do you think needs to be done to take that into account to guard against that potential?
Yeah, I think yo-yo dieting is a real concern, however you do it, and GLP-1 just exacerbates that. So I think it's the responsibility of anybody who's working in healthcare, who's working in the food system at any point, to really emphasize to any users of GLP-1 that this is your chance to take control. You're losing weight, so let's actually, while we're doing that, take on some practices which will help you to keep that weight off, which is going to be, healthy eating. It's going to be eating regularly, not skipping meals, making the most of every calorie, making it nutrient dense, while combining that with a higher level of activity, and particularly the resistance activity, by which I don't mean you've got to go in the gym and pump weights. I mean, there's lots of ways to use your body weight, or to just, do a few exercises, lifting, bottles of your Diet Coke or whatever at home. And there are some good resources out there. So in the UK, you can access the NHS website, which has got resistance exercises to do at home. So it doesn't need to be hard or difficult, but people do need to do it, and they do need help and advice to help them build better habits so that they have a chance of actually keeping the weight off once they've lost it.
Very good. And building on that effectively, I mean, I suppose people might see a risk of moving too quickly to pharmacological solutions in this space now that these medications are available. How do we make sure that non-pharmacological treatments maintain their place in the treatment of obesity and overweight?
At the minute, we're in the really weird situation that more people are buying the medication than are being prescribed it. Obviously, in the UK, there's a minority having free prescriptions, and again with some sort of medical insurance and things. Most people are, buying this, and they're expensive, so it is limiting uptake. Probably raising awareness among non-medicalized people trying to lose weight, hopefully raising awareness among for them that, by adopting better eating practices, by doing more activity, by trying to build muscle, you can actually do something positive, even if you don't have access to these sort of highly effective rapid weight loss medications. So I think, not everybody is going to end up using a GLP from a cost perspective, if nothing else. So we do need to still maintain emphasis on all the other ways that you can adopt to help yourself manage your weight in the environment that we're currently all living in.
Excellent. Professor Godson, turning to you, what is recommended in terms of people for maintaining weight loss? I guess the regimen of GLP-1s must remain in use throughout a lifetime. Is that the case?
Well, yeah, I mean, the analogy that's used in the kind of clinical obesity community at the moment really seems to be very much like this is like blood pressure medication. It's like a statin. This is for long-term use, and I think Angie has really highlighted the dangers of yo-yo usage. But I would say, the benefits of these drugs beyond weight loss are really remarkable, and so the savings that can probably be made by using them long term by health systems is something, particularly when we get, the cheaper and probably more available versions of them in terms of tablet form, or orally available ones. So I think that they're definitely here to stay. And also as we discover more and more effects of them that are really unrelated to the metabolic effects that we see just, from the type 2 diabetes journey all the way to the things that are being investigated right now around neuropsychiatric disorders. And so I think they're here long term.
You did mention that in your piece about the different benefits that people are discovering and that are being discovered in terms of the applicable uses of these medications. I think it's really worth reprising that for a moment. You've mentioned some of them there, but from your own perspective, what are the most exciting new areas of focus in that space in terms of the other benefits that these GLP-1s might deliver?
Well, as I kind of highlighted, the initial discovery in applications was around really the pancreas and the beta cells in the pancreas and stimulating insulin release, but that was really focusing just on receptors that were there. But we now know receptors, which are the targets of these drugs, are actually found in many blood vessels. They're found in different organs, and they're even found in the brain. So this sort of gives us a rational objective to sort of seek out what may be going on. And indeed, there's definite examples and evidence for gut-brain signaling through the vagus nerve, but also, as I say, they've now discovered receptors in the brain, and interestingly, they've discovered that the aversive responses and the responses that control appetite are at different locations in the brain. So a lot of the drug development at the moment is around trying to develop drugs that will specifically target the appetite control part of the brain and not the one that kind of tickles the nausea and the GI distress that's associated with them. So it's a very exciting area. Yeah.
Amazing indeed. Very, very exciting. Elizabeth, turning to you, you mentioned the regional contrast in your study on user behavior. What were the key takeaways that you had from that in terms of seeing different things in different regions, or indeed seeing similar behaviors?
Or when we look at similarities and differences across maybe the key markets that I mentioned, the US, UK, Brazil, and Mexico, maybe the two in LATAM, is actually there's more similarities than differences, which is good, right? Particularly for global companies that are looking to address this opportunity. Some of the similarities, I just want to maybe recap. The first one being intentional eating. Everything needs a purpose. And that includes intentional indulgence as well. So consumers will indulge, but it's intentional and being very focused around when they're going to do that. So intentional eating being a key takeaway. The second one is around high protein, low sugar, and in some cases higher fiber. That came through loud and clear through all consumer groups. And that's why you're seeing the dairy category in all of these markets really, really achieve growth from this consumer base that just naturally has digestive health benefits, can be lower in sugar if formulated correctly, and is high quality protein. So that was a key takeaway. The third one, we talked a lot about digestion support, and having digestion discomfort for these consumers is a similarity across all the markets. Maybe surprisingly was in Mexico. I would say maybe it was a little less of a concern, and they were more concerned around energy and immunity, but still came up in terms of concerns from consumers. And then last but not least, in terms of similarities, I would say we talked a little bit about the impact of purchase behavior change. It was consistent across all of our markets that we're seeing 85 to 90% of consumers change their habits in some way, shape, or form. And that was across all of the markets. Maybe a couple of nuanced differences. I would say the knowledge of nutrient intake. Probably not surprisingly, the US consumer probably a little less knowledgeable about what nutrients they need to take in to be healthy or to sustain versus a UK consumer, as an example. In addition, some markets, I'd call out Mexico and the UK, much more interested in snacking, whereas the US consumer much more focused on maybe meal replacement through beverage. And then surprisingly in LATAM, a big focus around meat consumption, probably tied to the protein element. But I think in LATAM countries, you have much more red meat consumption, perhaps. And so there was a lot more energy and talking about switching to a leaner protein source, whether it be white meat poultry or whether it be seafood, which that maybe meat consumption piece didn't come through as much in the other markets. So maybe just some key takeaways, but I think ultimately this consumer base is very similar across the larger markets.
Really interesting contrast. And we know a number of our viewers are going to be very interested in formulation. So a quick but essential question, Elizabeth, what are the taste attributes that appeal most to GLP-1 users? Have you seen that?
Yeah, so we called out a little bit already that definitely savory over sweet being a key trend across all markets. So you're kind of seeing sweetness levels come down and maybe some maybe spiciness or savoriness added to even indulgent products. So savory over sweet. Citrus is a big one in terms of it gives a health connotation, it gives a healthfulness. And so we're seeing these consumers gravitate towards citrus profiles. And then we're also seeing these consumers gravitate towards more global inspired flavors, which is a trend that's been happening forever. But I suppose this consumer is really wanting an adventure. And if they're going to eat something, they want it to be exciting, right? So if they're going to put the calories in their body, they want it to be something that maybe lifts them up. And then the last point I may call out is I did call out indulgence and intentional indulgence. Consumers will indulge here, I think, but it's important to remember is when they indulge, they want something equally as adventurous. So, you know, kind of the plain chocolates or the plain mochas or these types of things, like that's not overly exciting to this consumer group. So if you play in a more indulgent category, I think there's an opportunity to go very heavy on the adventurous side of indulgence and then making the formulation, of course, maybe just a little bit better for you, whether that's a reduced sugar or maybe an added protein. But that intentional indulgence of dialing up maybe some of the funness that can occur in those categories.
Very good. We'll be looking out for those profiles emerging across our shelves in the months and years ahead, and I'm sure ones that we'll all enjoy. You know, so good to see that developing. With that, we're at time for today. So I'd like to thank our contributors for an expert and really interesting perspective on this hugely important area. So Professor Godson, Elizabeth Horvath, Angie Jefferson, and Dr. Alexander Bolrick, thank you. And many thanks as well to our viewers for tuning in. We hope you found the content insightful, and we look forward to engaging you again on a future occasion. Bye for now.